Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome everyone to this Peak Prosperity Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Martenson, and it is September 6, 2018. Today, we are going to again be talking about the chemical herbicide glyphosate, which is the main active ingredient in the more commonly known Roundup product. We last covered this extensively in a podcast in November of 2016 after the release of a report by Food Democracy Now! That showed ridiculously high levels of glyphosate in many common foods, including organic foods, with the highest levels found in Cheerios. Yes, those things you put in the bag in front of your toddler. That report has been followed by other findings about glyphosate, many of them quite disturbing, and a high-profile court case that very recently went against Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer. As a quick reminder, Food Democracy Now! Or FDN is a grassroots community dedicated to building a sustainable food system that protects our natural environment and sustains farmers and nourishes families. From the FDN website, we read, quote, "Our food system is fundamentally broken. A few companies dominate the market, prioritizing profits over people and our planet. Government policies put the interest of corporate agribusiness over the livelihoods of farm families. Farm workers toil in unsafe conditions for minimal wages, and school children lack access to healthy foods, as well as millions of Americans living in poverty. From rising childhood and adult obesity to issues of food safety, air, water, and pollution, workers' rights, and global warming, our current food system is leading our nation to an unsustainable future." End quote. Yes, people, our food system, it is broken, and no, it doesn't have to remain that way. All of our interviews with Joel Salatin of Polyface Farm and the Kaisers of Singing Frog Farms, among many others, prove there is another way to farm that actually is in relationship to the earth, its rhythms, and all of life. Back with us and to tell us about glyphosate and the startling results of that recent court case is Dave Murphy, the founder and executive director of Food Democracy Now! Dave has been called the most crucial and politically savvy actor in the ongoing efforts to help move American agriculture into the 21st century as a result of his Sustainable Dozen campaign, which resulted in 4 candidates being placed in high-level positions at the USDA, and his efforts to reform food and agriculture under the Obama administration. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you, Chris. Real pleasure to be here today at Peak Prosperity. Really enjoy being on your podcast.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure's ours. So 2016, we last talked. Boy, so much has changed. New administration. Don't know if you noticed. Lots of things going on. But Dave, let's start with the big news before we get to those other pieces. The court case brought against Monsanto by Dwayne Johnson, which resulted in a $289 million verdict against Monsanto. Take us through the case. What was the complaint, and what was it that Monsanto actually lost in this case? How did they lose?
Well, this actually, that's a great question. This is really a landmark lawsuit. It really kind of opens a huge can of worms for Monsanto. And I guess I would say, the corruption of science by corporations like the pesticide industry. Monsanto has been the biggest bully on the block, and they are trying to protect their flagship product, Roundup. Dwayne Johnson is a former groundskeeper in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I think he started working there in 2012, and he developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma as a result of as he was applying this to the grounds at a schoolyard. Basically, he was accidentally sprayed with the product, and he read the instructions. I'm sure, he thought it was perfectly safe. Monsanto has always claimed that Roundup is, and this is what they've gotten away with. It's really hard to believe in the 21st century. Monsanto has gotten away with claiming that Roundup and glyphosate is safer than table salt. So on the back of their product listing on the basically you go to a Home Depot or any hardware store and you buy Roundup to spray weeds in your lawn or your yard, it says that glyphosate is not harmful to humans because we don't have basically the shikimic pathway. So it's not harmful to humans and mammals because allegedly we don't have a shikimic pathway, which is the mode of action by which glyphosate works. It blocks basically the production of certain essential aromatic amino acids, and in that process, it shuts down the plant's immune system. So Monsanto has always claimed that. The facts of recent scientists are showing that bacteria and viruses that are on our body, and especially our microbiome, contain the shikimic pathway, and that's really being shut down by glyphosate. So, Dwayne Johnson was exposed to this as working while he thought it was a safe product. He developed a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he has some very, very alarming lesions on his skin, and it's very painful. So he sued Monsanto, basically claiming that their product was unsafe, and they either should have known about it and knew it, or should have known about it, that it was dangerous. And I guess just a few weeks ago, a jury trial in San Francisco claimed that they held Monsanto responsible for negligent failure, for either they should have known or they knew that this product was dangerous. And during this lawsuit, hundreds, if not thousands of documents, technically hundreds of thousands of documents showed that behind the scenes, Monsanto scientists were actively working to either intimidate or bully other scientists at academic institutions when they were claiming their products were unsafe, or they were actively ghostwriting studies that were claiming that glyphosate and Roundup were perfectly safe.
Now, when they were doing that, let's talk about that, because, in response to the jury verdict, Monsanto Vice President Scott Partridge said, quote, "More than 800 scientific studies, the US EPA, the National Institutes of Health, and regulators around the world have concluded that glyphosate is safe for use and does not cause cancer," end quote. So he's got apparently a lot of data on his side, 800 studies. That sounds like a lot. Why would it go? Let's go through what the Monsanto scientists were actually doing. Because if theoretically, if you have 800 studies, they're all in agreement, you don't have to do a whole lot behind the scenes to monkey around with anything or ghostwrite or attempt to intimidate anybody. What exactly were the Monsanto scientists doing? What were they trying to hide in the background, given that we have 800 studies that all seem to be in agreement?
Well, a couple interesting facts. I think the first point of fact that needs to be pointed out is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. When a company submits an approval process for a brand new chemical or brand new formula for a weed killer or pesticide, they only have to submit safety studies on the active ingredient, so the main active ingredient. So Roundup is a weed killer that's sprayed on fields. Its an active ingredient is glyphosate. Technically, they only submitted studies in the 70s and 80s trying to claim that glyphosate was perfectly safe. The problem is glyphosate is never sprayed on a field or on a food crop by itself. It's always sprayed in a dynamic formula. In this case, it's Roundup is the most famous, flagship product that Monsanto has. So these products have surfactants, and the surfactants are what they allow that active ingredient to penetrate the plant cell's walls, or to penetrate the root system, or to break into the leaf structure of that plant and actually kill it. Most weed killers that they spray on plants are more caustic, but the way that glyphosate and Roundup actually work, it's kind of a unique product that it actually, I think I mentioned this earlier, it shuts down the shikimic pathway, which basically shuts down the plant's autoimmune system. And so really what happens is it kills beneficial microorganisms in the soil, and pathogenic microorganisms in the soil come up into the plant's immune system and kill it. That's how it actually dies. So the fascinating thing, during this court discovery, I have a document right here. This is one of my favorite ones. It's from Monsanto's lead toxicologist. As she's being deposed by the plaintiff's attorneys, Dr. Donna Farmer recognized that Monsanto cannot say that Roundup does not cause cancer because we, Monsanto, have not done the carcinogenic studies with Roundup. She goes on to say that the EPA does not require those carcinogenic studies for Roundup, only for the active ingredient, glyphosate. So you have to understand, the American public really has to understand that the rules of our regulatory system, the rules of our democracy have been rigged against us by pesticide and chemical companies, just like the tobacco industry did this 40 and 50 years ago.
But Dave, I'm still confused. If these studies all show, if there's 800 studies proving that this stuff is safe, what were Monsanto scientists actually doing?
Well, it's interesting that there's 800 studies proving it's safe. I think that's really kind of slicing the deck a little close to the truth. Monsanto scientists, there's a couple studies that have come out, a couple scientists and a couple studies that have come out pretty famously. One is by Gary Williams, and he wrote in 2000 he published a paper. Basically, it was at that time it was the largest cancer review or carcinogenic review of glyphosate, and internal documents show that Monsanto scientists actually helped him ghostwrite that study. It says we ghostwrite the exposure and toxicology and genotoxic sections. Recall this is how we handled Williams, Crows, and Monroe in 2000. So basically, in these internal documents, internal emails, Monsanto scientists are really responding, kind of panicked, to the World Health Organization's IARC, or International Agency for Research on Cancer, review that came out in March of 2015 that declared glyphosate a probable human carcinogen. That is the opening salvo that really unleashed the lawsuits against Monsanto. Finally, had a respected international scientific body claiming that glyphosate was probably carcinogenic to humans. It kind of put blood in the water, but also what it did is Monsanto kind of tried to rally the troops behind the scenes, and all these internal documents that came out in the lawsuit are showing how not only are they trying to attack the World Health Organization's IARC, which is one of the most prestigious cancer review agencies on the planet, there's internal document emails between Monsanto scientists and toxicologists. They actually tell each other that they ghost wrote these scientific studies in 2000, and they also helped ghostwrite the 2015 wrote the cancer review paper from Grime, which is very that was a big response from the biotech industry from Monsanto when the IARC study came out.
And so this sounds suspiciously like what was going on with the tobacco industry for a long time, which is just simply, you've got a product that's got some rough edges on it. You know that it's not completely safe, and so you have to do what you can to try and keep a lid on the information as best you can for as long as you can. And so, what was it then that as I understand it, that in this court case, that it wasn't that the jury found in that Roundup or glyphosate in this case causes cancer. What they found was that, take us through that. What exactly did they find against Monsanto in this case?
Well, they found that they've been aware of these risks. The glyphosate-based herbicides are carcinogenic or probably carcinogenic. Mm-hmm. So, in a jury trial, it's much different than an appeals court trial, which we can talk about later. The jury trial was really exposed to the back and forth between Monsanto scientists. They didn't rule that glyphosate causes cancer. They ruled that Monsanto should have known or knew, and that they were negligent in allowing this product on the market. And and because of that, they should be held liable in the public, court of public opinion.
So that Monsanto has some data. It's definitely not safe as table salt. They know this, and they've been working behind the scenes to hide it. These documents come out in the court case. The jury takes a look at this and says, gosh, big corporation, look, you knew these things. You knew these were risks. You downplayed them on purpose. And so in that court case, $289 million sounds like a lot. As I understand it, $39 million of that went to compensate for pain and suffering because the non-Hodgkin lymphoma is going to take Mr. Dwayne Johnson out very painfully fairly soon. So $39 million for that. $250 million punitive, meaning we're going to punish the corporation for their behavior. I assume that $250 million was directed at this thing that we're discussing now, which was Monsanto's own scientists behind the scenes working to minimize, ghostwrite, muddy the waters, and also whatever internal documents they'd come forward with and findings they had about glyphosate. They didn't reveal those as well. Those are the sorts of things I assume came out in the discovery process that were presented at trial. Yeah,
exactly. Ghostwriting studies, basically corporate ghostwriting is a corporate scientist at Monsanto wrote then, and there's a very famous section in this that came out in the discovery documents where the lead toxicologist, not the one that had just done a farmer, the one that admitted that they can't say Roundup. It's pretty bad when your company's lead toxicologist say, we can't say that Roundup doesn't cause cancer because we've only tested glyphosate. So I think that kind of information, along with the fact that they had successfully bullied or intimidated scientists, they successfully manipulated they interfered with scientific journals when a scientific study came out critical of glyphosate, showing that it caused genotoxic or probable carcinogenic responses in humans. Monsanto kind of unleashed like a mafia-style attack on those scientists and those institutions. One of the most famous ones is the Seralini study from September 2012. That was a 2-year study that reproduced Monsanto's own study on a corn variety Mon 810. So it's Monsanto 810. And basically, for a safety review, people need to understand this. For a safety assessment in the United States and in Europe, these companies, Monsanto only has to do a 90-day safety assessment. So they test Monsanto's glyphosate on lab rats for 90 days. And a lab rat's full life cycle is 2 years. So what Seralini did, this professor in France did, he and his team did a 2-year toxicology study, duplicating the same study that Monsanto did. They used the same kind of rats, Sprague Dawley rats, which are commonly used in toxicology and cancer studies because they're prone to growing tumors. And what Seralini's study showed in 2012, after 2 years of being fed glyphosate and Roundup in their feed and also in their water, that they developed tumors at 3 to 4 times the rate of normal, these rats did, and they also died earlier. And Monsanto successfully debunked that study and got it retracted from the journal that it was originally published in. And they almost ended Seralini's career. They were so vicious in their attack on him.
And when they went after it, were they going after, was it just study design, or were they actually hinting that there was fraud or misconduct? What were they, how did they go after that? Do you know?
Well, they used what would appear to be independent academics or independent public, like land grant scientists. There's a scientist at University of Florida, Kevin Folta. He was formerly the head of plant horticulture at University of Florida. He and there's another one, Academics Review. I think the guy's name is Bruce Chassie. He's from University of Illinois. They use these scientists and they put them up. They put them up in the public media as independent sources, and they attacked Seralini. They said the study was bunk. They said they didn't use enough lab rats. They claimed that it was a cancer study. When the study, and Seralini never used the word cancer, it was actually a toxicology study. So this with the background in toxicology. Toxicology studies that show harm and likely harm are way different than cancer studies. Yeah. And so cancer studies require that you use a larger number of rats. So I think Seralini duplicated the Monsanto study. So they only used 10 rats per male and female. So 20 rats per group. And so Monsanto really muddied the water in the media in the United States, and they also got away with claiming that Seralini used a rat that was prone to cancer. And everyone should know that Seralini set out initially to duplicate Monsanto's own safety assessment that product was accepted for approval in Europe. So instead of a 90-day study, he'd done a number of other studies before this. He and a team had done other studies. And they initially looked into Monsanto's claim that glyphosate or Roundup rapidly biodegrades in the environment. And they found that to be absolutely false. And I think there's 2 landmark court cases, one in France and one in New York State Court, that showed that Monsanto had fraudulently marketed Roundup as safe or benign for the environment. And I think in the advertisements in France, they actually said that glyphosate cleans up the soil. So that's a pretty ballsy statement, I have to say. They're pretty clever advertising. But they were saying that it rapidly, degrades in the environment, that it doesn't stick around in the soil, which turns out to be absolutely false. It can stick around for anywhere between 6 months to 20 years, depending on the soil type. Wow.
Yeah, that's very persistent. So, well, listen, we've got some basic data here. One study I'm looking at says that glyphosate, the core ingredient in Roundup, that the levels in human bloodstream have spiked by more than 1,000% in the last couple of decades. We know that the idea behind Roundup-ready GMO plants was that it was going to actually reduce this herbicide use. In fact, herbicide use is up by nearly 500 million pounds since that point in time. So it's being used more and more. We know that we have a lot of studies coming out saying there are significant public health concerns. And in particular, we're starting to discover the intersection, as you mentioned, the shikimate pathway, which is not found in mammalian cells. So technically, glyphosate shouldn't be that harmful to mammalian cells, but I am not a mammalian cell. I'm a collection of mammalian cells in symbiosis with a lot of beneficial gut biome bacteria and other things. And so those are impacted by, they do have the shikimate pathway, many of them. And so if they are impacted, then my gut biome gets dysregulated, and we know now that can lead to all kinds of things, enormously complex. So I just want to take this back for just a second, because with my background in toxicology, I will tell you that I do not trust, not even for a skinny minute, any of the tox tests that come from these large corporations, because one thing that we know about medical testing, this is even done under the careful auspices of the FDA, looking at a clinical phase 3 trial. This is in humans. We know that study results that come out that don't support what the pharmaceutical companies wish often get rejected or chucked out or not looked at or don't become part of the larger data set. This kind of stuff happens all the time. But what you're talking about in this past study, where somebody was running a standard tox test, where you might say, well, we're going to have, let's say we have 3 different doses, low, medium, and high, so many milligrams per kilogram. And we're going to have a 4th group, which is placebo control. We're going to double blind this. So we're going to take all of our compounds, all the doses plus a placebo, put them in tubes so we can't identify what's what, administer them, track everything. So total of 80 rats over 2 years. Hey, some of them don't live all that time. So you're probably down to a sample set of, I'm going to guess, 65, 70.
Yeah, listen, I would just say the microbiome story, for me, when I look at this, it's really, what's worse, cancer or the destruction of your immune system? In a lot of cases, there's 18 to 20 million people that have in America that have gluten intolerance. And really what they're not really gluten intolerant. What they're intolerant to is the pesticide glyphosate that's sprayed on wheat, oat, and barley as a pre-harvest drying agent. As you mentioned, the microbiome, the microbiome scientists have studied your stomach is your second brain. There's a gut-brain axis, and glyphosate really significantly disrupts the microbiome in humans, just like it disrupts the microbiome in the soil. So the ironic thing is, while farmers are spraying Roundup on their fields to kill weeds, they're actually destroying their soil fertility over the long term. And there's scientists in the Midwest that have shown Roundup and glyphosate are linked to serious crop diseases like sudden death syndrome in soybeans, and also Gauss's wilt in corn, which pretty much it can lead to a 40 to a 70% loss of those farmers' crops when it becomes widespread. But the thing is, if it destroys the microbiome in the soil and it impacts those crops' health, it is also impacting the human gut microbiome. And so a number of studies have come out since we last talked in 2016. Let me mention the first one is the Ramazzini Institute, which is a fairly famous cancer review agency in Italy, but also in Europe. They just came out with a study linking EMFs and cell phone radiation to changes in human genes and being harmful to humans. Last fall, they came out with a study that showed that there's a 13-week preliminary study that showed that pregnant rats fed glyphosate, their rat pups microbiome is disrupted while they're in the womb. For any mother that's that's pregnant right now, or that's eating food that's not organic, that should be very concerning. And that corresponds to a study published last year in Indiana, where the scientists did a cohort review of, I think it was 100 pregnant women in Indiana. And they found that women that had the highest levels of glyphosate in their urine also had the worst birth outcomes. So that means they had stillbirths, miscarriages, and low birth weights. And when we interviewed one of the doctors that had been a part of that study, he was absolutely flabbergasted that the U.S. government is allowing this chemical to be used in such a widespread way, and also in ways that endanger human health. So not only do we have studies showing that glyphosate is impacting baby rats in the mother's uterus while they're pregnant, there's a new study that came out, I think in May of this year, May of 2018. It says glyphosate-based herbicide exposure affects gut microbiota, and it creates anxiety and depression-like behavior in rats. I think for any parent hearing that, they should be very shocked, because there's been a real spike in anxiety and depression, especially among millennials. I was at a friend of mine's house a month ago, and basically she does a CSA in Los Angeles, community supported agriculture. She provides, fresh fruits and vegetables from organic farms and biodynamic farms to customers in the LA area. And her daughter came down, we were talking about glyphosate, and she goes, "Oh my God, do you think that could be causing anxiety and depression? Because all my friends have severe anxiety and depression." So I think there's really more to the story. It's the cancer, I would just say glyphosate does not just cause cancer, and that's not the scariest aspect of it. If you have a chemical that's genotoxic and also causing, major disruption of the human gut microbiome, you have a product that is causing massive damage, not only in the environment, but in human health.
Well, absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought up that Ramazzini Institute study. I've looked at that one. And one of the report's authors, Danielle Mandrioli, clearly this was the summary of the study. Quote, she said, "Disruption of the microbiome has been associated with a number of negative health outcomes such as obesity, diabetes, and immunological problems." To that list, we could add some of the things you just mentioned, anxiety, depression, things like that. And so disruption of the microbiome is now being associated with a lot of things pretty conclusively. What caught me was that Scott Partridge, again, Monsanto's VP for Global Strategy, in response to that said this, quote, "The Ramazzini Institute is an activist organization with an agenda that they have not disclosed as part of their crowdfunding efforts. Boo. They wish to support a ban on glyphosate, and they have a long history of rendering opinions that are not supported by regulatory testing agencies. This is not about genuine research. All the research to date has demonstrated there is no link between glyphosate and cancer." I don't believe that Danielle mentioned cancer once. They talked about disruption of the microbiome. This quote doesn't really seem to be right up the center of the pike in terms of rebutting it, but it got run in all the newspapers I saw.
I would just say Monsanto, the masters of manipulation in terms of public opinion. They attack these scientists, like you said. It doesn't mention cancer; it mentions the microbiome. They know that they probably know that this is a long-term cancer study, which is why they're trying to get out ahead of it. Mm-hmm. But it's pretty shocking. Let's look at this: obesity, diabetes, and immune disorders. Those are the health problems that have exploded in the United States and Europe in epidemic proportions in the last 20 years. Now, what do we have? What's the one thing that's changed in our food supply in the last 20 years? It's being sprayed with tons of pesticides. And I would just say, I have long advocated for labeling of genetically engineered foods because I believe that Americans have basically a democratic right to know what's in their food. I've also done a 12-year review of the studies on GMOs. I would just say I am concerned about GMO safety for the environment and human and animal health, but I'm more concerned about pesticide impact on the environment, like Roundup and like glyphosate. The thing is, now the first generation GMO crops have failed. Now Roundup is being paired with dicamba and 2,4-D. So the crops, dicamba and 2,4-D won't be sprayed on oats, wheat, and barley. Those are not GMO crops. That's particularly just to dry that crop in the farmer's field, so it can be sold directly to the marketers faster. So for manufacturing, but we now have much more toxic chemicals to human health and to animal health being sprayed in a widespread over the environment. So I'm sure you're aware that the dicamba, Roundup Ready dicamba soybean disaster in rural America. Basically, there's over 3 million acres that have been damaged because Monsanto released a formulation of Roundup and dicamba that had not yet been approved for the market, and it's really wreaked havoc in rural America, especially among soybean farmers.
Yeah, I'd heard about that, and it's led to suicides and deaths and all kinds of things. It's tempers are high, I've heard. And
one murder in a case. I can't remember if that was in Arkansas or South.
It sounds about right. Yeah,
Southwest Missouri, but down in that area.
Yeah. So just to continue this, in the last 25 years, sperm counts in humans have declined by about 40% worldwide, and there's lots of evidence that we have sort of these there's a big ecological disaster unfolding. I happen to have my finger on the neonicotinoids as a particularly nasty pesticide. I call it a biocide more than a pesticide. Kills everything pretty broadly.
Really?
It's just, brilliantly awful stuff.
Sure.
And so as we look at this, it's the overall death by 1,000 cuts, having some of these big bad things out there is not good. But as you're talking about, when you're disrupting the microbiomes of soil, guts, things like that, you're really tinkering with something that out of sight, out of mind, way too complex to understand, except by what results from that. You can sort of see, oh, well, that was a bad idea. Look at the wilt disease showing up. But I'm looking here now it's a new peer-reviewed study. It comes to us from King's College in London, led by a Dr. Michael and Antonio, using profiling methods that looking at the molecular composition of livers of female rats, given an extremely low dose of Roundup weed killer over a 2-year period. So this long-running study. And what they found was that these animals suffered from non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Big mouthful. I'll get to what that means in a second. But this is a causative link that's been demonstrated. It's at an environmentally relevant level of Roundup consumption. I mean, these are tiny, ultra low doses. Let me look at this. Yeah, 4 nanograms per kilogram, 75,000 times below the EU limits, 437,000 times below the U.S. permitted levels, and still it resulted in this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. What's so bad about that? Well, risk factors to having that disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, include being overweight, obese, having diabetes, high cholesterol or high triglycerides. Risk factors, symptoms might include fatigue, weakness, weight loss, loss of appetite, nausea, abdominal pain, etc. So it's not a great thing to have. And so here we've just got another study comes out that says at the nanogram level, there's beginning to find causative link. That's a really strong statement for a doctor to be saying in this particular case.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Antonio is a great researcher. He is doing some really groundbreaking research in the UK. That study came out, and you're right. People should be alarmed. I mean, I'm not sure why the British government and the American government are not actively. I mean, I do understand why. The corporate influence of our regulatory system, the corporate influence of our elected officials. But I'll just say these are really massive public health epidemics. The fatty liver disease, I remember when that came out, I knew that it was going to come out, and I knew some of the findings were going to be pretty explosive. But these things blow over so quickly in the media. The real problem is 25% of the U.S. population, the same number in England, are now having non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And it's really a major disruption to a person's life. I mean, the government should really be asking themselves, if we're supporting food and pesticide companies that are creating health problems, the American taxpayer is actually paying for that in our healthcare system. The obesity epidemic and type 2 diabetes are estimated to possibly bankrupt the U.S. government by 2030 or 2040. That's pretty scary. And it's kind of shocking that our regulatory agency and elected officials don't take this stuff seriously.
Oh, it is. It really is. Now, Dave, I want to follow up. So your big study that came out from Food Democracy Now! Back in 2016, first, what other studies have followed and perhaps inspired to repeat or maybe even refute your findings that showed glyphosate in every product tested, including the so-called organic products in many cases? What sort of followed on since then, and what's the blowback been? Has anybody come out and said you got this wrong? We didn't find any of this stuff here, and have any of these so-called regulatory agencies attempted to repeat your findings?
Well, I'll just say, hilariously, no U.S. regulatory agency has made an effort to repeat our findings. There was. Right. I'm just saying they haven't publicly done this. There was some preliminary efforts behind the scenes, and they'd been presented at USDA kind of public forums, but only that were for USDA scientists. And I think Carrie Gillam, who's a former reporter from Reuters, and people should be familiar with Carrie Gillam's work. She's a former reporter for Reuters who was basically driven off the beat at Reuters because she was writing about GMOs, and she was actually quoting opponents of biotechnology, and Monsanto and the biotech industry found that offensive, so they basically got her fired. She now writes for and works as a lead researcher for a public interest group called U.S. Right to Know, and she's covered the science behind this pretty extensively, and she published a book last year called Whitewash. And if you're really interested in this story, you should probably buy this book. It's a pretty fascinating read. I'm sorry to make a plug for it here, but whitewash. It's the story of a weed killer, cancer, and the corruption of science. But she has basically followed this story from start to finish, and pretty much shown exactly what we've been talking about. There's been a real corruption of the science behind the scenes. There's been a push in the regulatory agencies to bury any of the harm that has been found by independent scientists. And even in Europe, there's a fascinating, I don't know if you have this on the agenda to talk, but I just want to insert it here. In the corruption of science is so bad. While Europe was trying to do a 15-year safety assessment of glyphosate, whether they're going to review it for 15 years, just like the US EPA had to do, they discovered that basically EFSA, which is the European Food Safety Agency, they had actually cut and pasted dozens and dozens of pages of documents from a Monsanto-led glyphosate task force. So it's so bad, basically, that these companies have rigged the regulatory agencies against us and get their scientists to basically allow a corruption of the public regulatory records.
So this sounds fairly epidemic, across all the so-called democracies out there at this point. Is that true?
Yeah, it is.
I'm really interested in the blowback to your study and whether any of the big agencies have, so-called regulatory agencies have repeated your studies, or if Monsanto's, come after you, astroturfing or through the front door. Either way, what's happened as a response to discovering all that glyphosate in our food?
That's a great question. I would just say the U.S. federal government has not tried to duplicate our studies. I think there'd been some early efforts in 2016 to try to look for where glyphosate was. And then under the Obama administration, they stopped doing the testing. And also under the Trump administration, there's some talk that they were going to restart it. But hilariously, what's happened with food actually now, Monsanto has not successfully debunked our study. The real thing is we used an FDA laboratory, a laboratory that the FDA contracts with. So they really can't attack basically the science, the scientific methods that we use. They did have on their Facebook page within 24 hours a response saying that this is not accurate. These are not unsafe levels. You would basically have to eat 250 times the amount of a bowl of cereal to have a negative impact. The one thing is that we've been hacked repeatedly. I'll just say that within 24 hours of that, our report coming out in November 2016, I lost my first laptop to being hacked. My cell phone was hacked a week after that. And a month after putting out that report, I lost my second laptop. So, and then 2017, we were hacked in March, April, and May. And July of 2017, we got hacked and they went into our server and deleted our entire website from the internet.
What?
Yeah, seriously. So our website was deleted from the internet for 10 days. And my tech team had to try to put back together a matchstick version of it. So we've been under attack behind the scenes, but nothing publicly. They haven't been able to successfully debunk our study. They've used basically like public interest scientists at land-grant universities like Kevin Folta and Bruce Chassey to kind of throw some flack at our study. I think Kevin Folta tried to say you would have to eat 1 billion bowls of Cheerios to have a negative impact, and which is just outrageous. Half a bowl of Cheerios will cause harm to a 1-year-old child's stomach, to a 2-year-old child. It can negatively impact their microbiome. Going back to the microbiome here, people should know that it's your not only your immune system, but 95% of your body's serotonin is found in your stomach. That is a neurotransmitter that helps basically respond to happiness levels or anxiety levels. So if you're having a child at 1 or 2 years old being exposed to high levels of glyphosate on a regular basis, Cheerios is the most popular cereal that a mother will feed their child. And they'll do it for years because those children have little tiny fingers and they like to grab a hold of those round, like oats, I guess was what you call them. But since then, groups that have come out with some glyphosate testing, I think Organic Consumers Association came out with some glyphosate testing in Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and they found very low levels, like I think like 1.5 or 2.5 parts per billion. in their ice cream, which is pretty low, but they did find it. And I know they have a campaign right now. Another group, Center for Environmental Health, came out with glyphosate residue studies. And I think recently Environmental Working Group came out with a review of cereals. And they basically confirmed that our studies, basically our findings, that Cheerios has glyphosate in it, but I think they found it was at a much lower levels than that we tested at.
Yeah, so let's talk to what people can do about this. So, Dave, how do you avoid glyphosate in your diet? And if you do, how do you do that?
Well, listen, the best way to avoid glyphosate is to eat an organic diet. Some people will claim that they can't afford it.
Yep.
There are a number of places on the internet. One is Thrive Market, and I'll put in a shameless plug for them just because they do offer organic and non-GMO products at 25 to 50% off. So anyone out there listening claiming they can't afford organics, and I'll just say this, I've had friends of mine that work on Wall Street tell me that organics is too expensive.
Yeah.
And I'm like, listen, if you're investing in blue chip stocks, you should really realize the most important thing you're investing in is you and your children's health. And that starts with the food that you put in your body and the food that you feed your children. So listen, I avoid glyphosate at all costs. I even make sure when I travel, I carry organic snacks with me. So I actually, I was diagnosed with leaky gut in 2014 and also SIBO last year. So I've had to heal myself from these autoimmune problems caused by glyphosate. I'll just say I lived less than 300 yards from a GMO cornfield in Iowa for 2 years. So I'm not saying that that's what caused it, but it probably didn't help my health that much. And the best way to listen, if you eat any wheats, oats, or barley products, if you eat oatmeal, make sure you take the time to buy an organic version of that product. It is really worth a little bit of extra cost. $1 extra per box will save you from having serious, gut dysbiosis or serious health problems.
I hate to go this far down into this rabbit hole, but would this potentially include, say, specialty beers that are crafted with those same products?
Actually, you know what? You're right. That's a good thought there. Good question. In Germany, they tested beers, and 90% of their beers tested positive for glyphosate. I don't think there's been any testing of U.S. beers or microbreweries, but if you can eat organic and drink organic beers, I would do that.
Well, and how about on the positive side of this story? I know that one of the chief ways that it ends up, particularly in oats and barley, is because of the use of Roundup or glyphosate more generically as a desiccant, meaning you got your crops out there, they're still alive, you want them to die and begin to dry so you can get some of the drying done courtesy of the sun out in the field. Have any farmers begun to move away from using Roundup as a desiccant?
Yeah, actually, since we published our report in fall of 2016, farmers in Canada and also in the United States are moving away from spraying Roundup as a desiccant. There's actually, I can't remember the name of it, but there is at least one large grain mill in the Midwest that actively has said we will no longer accept any grain, any oats, wheats, or barley from farmers that use Roundup or glyphosate as a pre-harvest drying agent, because it's just they don't want the legal liability of a lawsuit against them, especially with the IARC's ruling in 2015.
Well, that's some good news then. So, Dave, you're doing incredible work. I'm really glad that your study had a really nice impact, and it feels like the larger part of this story is really about corporate malfeasance and hiding and doing whatever they need to do to make another buck, but really checking the morality at the door and just doing stuff that is frankly, antisocial at best. I'll be kind and leave it there. So thank you for that. Please tell people how they can follow your work and your excellent organization and whatever else you're up to.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for the interview. I really appreciate the follow-up here. There's been a lot of important developments as we've discussed, and your audience is a really dynamic audience. There are a lot of leaders in their field, so they should hear about this stuff. So, up front, I would say, I call Monsanto's scientists basically like sociopaths with a science degree. That's a nice way to put it. But if you want to follow our work, you can go to fooddemocracynow.org. You can go to our website and sign up, or you can follow us on Twitter at food_democracy, and go to our Facebook page at Food Democracy Now. And we post regular updates to the latest stuff happening, not just in glyphosate, not just in Roundup, but all of food and agricultural policy.
All right. Well, we've been talking with Dave Murphy of Food Democracy Now! Dave, thank you so much for your time today and the work you're doing in the world. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's really a pleasure to be on your podcast again. I'm a big fan of peak prosperity, so keep it up.
Well, thank you very much.